Okay. So in the first talk in this series that I focused on how to think about your research plan, how to think about the various aspects of what's required in an NIH-style research plan, and how to basically think of a research plan as a sales and marketing document to really, and the thing you're trying to sell is your research to potential funders. But one of the things that I found is that folks really have a tendency to overemphasize the research plan components or underemphasize the research plan components, and they basically don't put the rest of the application into the correct mindset. They do it kind of haphazardly. They do it with a like, oh, I just have to fill this out, but nobody cares. And especially for young investigators, which I believe everybody on the call is, the rest of the stuff that's not the research plan is actually as important as your research plan itself. And this includes pieces like the training pieces of the application as well. So with that, the first thing, let's see if they're going to let me do this. Okay. So there's a lot of non-research plan things that are in the application, and these include things such as your environment pages, your biosketch, your budget and budget justification, and all the research compliance issues. And while it's tempting to say, oh, this is just bureaucratic paperwork and I just have to fill out something, a good reviewer who actually is doing their job the way they're supposed to really looks at these pieces super carefully, because these are the pieces of the application that tell the reviewer that not only that you can actually carry out the work you've been proposing, because if the environment isn't conducive to the research plan, doesn't matter how great your ideas are, if you can't do them, you shouldn't get the money for it. Similarly, your biosketch, you can have great ideas, but if you have no experience dealing with the ins and outs of what you're studying, then there's a lower confidence and that there's a chance of success, the project will be important. Budget and justification, similar issues where if you don't have enough money to do the work, you can't get it done. And if you, also it's important not to ask for too much money. Also, the research compliance issues can, if those are not all in place properly, they can absolutely shut down your research project. And one other piece that I didn't list as a bullet, but since many of you are going to be applying for K awards, and I think that we might even have some F-32 applications on the call, or other people who are interested in other career development applications, your actual well-analyzed career development plan can often make or break your application. Okay, so I'll go through what some of these things are. And the thing that I can't emphasize enough, I think that the biggest mistake that a naive grant writer does, and it's just something that happens when you're inexperienced, is that there's this tendency to leave the non-research plan components for last, just because you're so overwhelmed by the actual research, specific aims and research plans. However, when to be writing that, putting together your initial formulation or your research plan takes a lot of brain cells, I guess is a good way to put it. But the non-research plan components often require a lot of legwork, and sometimes they just require you to be able to write them, let them sit, and then have you reread them to make sure there's not anything missing. And usually when I start writing a grant, the first thing I do is make a list of all of the required non-research plan components and start to decide which of these things I need to work on. Now, as a long-term funded person, I have the huge advantage that I can go into my file folders on my computer and I can pull out sort of baseline drafts of things. So usually when I'm submitting biosketches or environment pages or data sharing plans, I already have the text, and all I'm doing is updating. It is very, very different if you're developing these things to start with, and you really want to give yourself the time to do them well. And starting out to write a grant 2 and hopefully 3 months out minimum is not a mistake. To know exactly what you need and what legwork you need to get every single piece of this. Okay. So some of the huge reasons that early starts are important, and that when early starts have not having an early start have caused nearly complete grant applications to even never reach submission. Since a lot of the people on the call are interested in community medicine, or they could be interested in working with MCures or other kinds of educational grants, that you very well may find yourself working at an institution doing really important work in education or medicine, but they don't have a strong history of grant support. So they don't have a dedicated research office, or their dedicated research office is very inexperienced. And that's a big problem if you're working at such an institution, but it's also a big issue if you're collaborating with such an institution. So let's say you're doing an educational grant with small colleges without a lot grant writing experience, or you're working with the community health center that just might not have the infrastructure for doing grants. And if they do not have institutional compliance paperwork in place with the government, it can take months and months and months for that to come out. This could be everything from the tax ID number to all of the research compliance paperwork numbers. And there are also institutional IDs that the big granting agencies have and require for money to go to an institution. And that paperwork can sometimes take months, especially if you're working with a small institution that just doesn't have any of the paperwork in place. Another big thing that can happen is that if you're collaborating with people who don't apply for grants regularly, it can take significant time to get their biosketches and their environment pages into a compliant format. This is a huge issue when you're collaborating or working with clinicians, that they just don't have modernly compliant biosketches. The biosketch changed 3 or 4 years ago, and even some of you have collaborators and mentors in your MRDA applications where their biosketch is not compliant with federal guidelines. And it was allowed to get through for the MRDA, but when you actually go to apply for larger grant mechanisms, you need to make sure that all of those biosketches are fully compliant. Similarly is environment pages, that let's say you are working with a clinician who is at a different institution. They might not have all the information in the environment pages that really sell why that's a good collaboration. And you need to give significant time to help that happen. To be honest, I have collaborated with clinicians where it just came to the point where I got their CV, and I wrote their biosketch for them. And then I sent it back to them and let them approve the final biosketch. Because if I hadn't done their biosketch, it would have never gotten done and the application wouldn't have gone in. And that's just the reality. If you're working with people with a heavy clinical load, you have to be willing to help with those sorts of gaps. Another place that can be a problem is that there's something called an ERA Commons ID. I assume that everybody on the call has one of those, because I think you needed it to have to do the MRDA application. But if you are working with clinicians that maybe never applied on an NIH grant, they need to get ERA Commons IDs. And that depending on the institution, this could take some time, either because the clinician is just busy, or it could be that the institution that they work with doesn't have the infrastructure to request that ERA Commons ID. Now, something that if you're applying to things like the CTR pilots, that those don't typically require IRCOOK or IRB approval at the time of application. However, sometimes they do. And that if you don't have the approval at the time of application, you absolutely should make sure that you at least have your protocol submitted by the time of application, because they can't give you any money if they're not approved. And something like an IRB can sometimes take months of going back and forth for approval if you have a complicated protocol. And it's nothing more kind of disappointing to get a good score on a grant, but you don't get the money because you don't have all your regulatory approvals in place. And there is also the deal that many small foundation grants require all the regulatory approvals to be in place at the time of submission. So, you have to back plan to make sure you have all those things in place. And I think anybody who has ever done any kind of clinical research or research with animals knows that IACUC and IRB approvals are not quick, even in research-intensive locations where these things go through, have a very good infrastructure. It can be even worse at institutions that have a lower amount of research activity. Another thing to keep in mind is that research office and compliance staff can have heavy workloads. And those workloads really get bad right around the uniformed deadlines. That you might be applying for an NIH grant for a March 1st deadline, but so is everybody else at your institution applying to the same grant. And they just don't have the time to look at all of your stuff if you turn it in at the drop deadline line, which could be a week or two before the grant's due. However, that all the research offices have basically up and down workloads. So they have big gaps where there's really no major deadlines. And if you send in documents, they will read them for you carefully and make sure you don't have any mistakes and everything's fully compliant. While if you are turning your stuff in near the deadline like everybody else, you're just not going to have the staff to have time to go through all your documents with a fine-tooth comb. And while, yes, it's frustrating to submit stuff to the research office and they say, oh, it's not in good shape, or no, you need to revise these things, or no, you missed this part of the application, you way, way rather have your research and compliance offices catch those mistakes than go ahead and submit the application and then have your funding agency catch the mistakes, because such mistakes can lead to an application to be bounced without review. And then the last reason that you just want to get all of the other paperwork done ahead of time is that you will not feel like it near the deadline. Human nature is such that you're going to get very, very focused in making your research plan as absolutely perfect as possible. And you want to be spending your time with those final edits. Let's say you have your application done as the first draft 3 weeks out, and you give it to all your mentors, you give it to anybody else who's willing to read it. Well, those comments are going to be trickling in over the next 3 weeks. And you might not get comments until the day or two before it's due. You want to spend your time fixing your research plan in those day or two before it's due. You don't want to spend your time chasing or regulatory paperwork or refining your biosketch. Okay. So the first step when planning a grant application is just to tell people you're actually going to apply. Now, everybody on this call is at different flavors of institution with different rules. That if you're going to apply for a deadline, so let's say you're applying for that March 2nd CTR pilot, that you should be telling your grant administration no later than January 2nd that you're going to be applying. To be perfectly honest, I wouldn't think it's untoward to tell them now that you're applying for that deadline. Is that because you want to know exactly their deadlines for each piece of paperwork. And all of the institutions that are parts of the CTR network all have very, very different deadlines for when all the paperwork needs to be in your research office. And you want to make sure that you know when all of that needs to be done. And that particularly if you're working in a non-research intensive institution, generally those lead times are greater simply because they just don't have the staff to be able to handle the applications. And the other thing is that your departmental or institutional grants administrators, a lot of their job is that to tell you what you need to be doing to do the submission. And that if you get that, have that sit down 2 or 3 months out, then you will have a list of absolutely everything you need to collect, both to comply with the grant, but also to keep in mind that there's another whole level of bureaucracy at your institution. And different institutions have different rules for different types of jobs. And another thing is that it helps them plan their workload to be able to help you optimally. Grants administrators here often will ask, what are your planned submissions in the next 3 to 4 months? Because grant submitters or grant administrators, they take vacation too. And generally, they try to plan their vacation around a major deadline. But if it turns out the major deadline is when they're on vacation, that they will tell you that so that you know that you have to get certain things done way ahead of time, so that you can get all the help that you need for a successful application. And then the last thing you have to understand is that grants really are generally not made to individuals. They're made to institutions. So you as an employee of your institution is preparing a grant application that's going to be submitted by the institution. So that's why the bureaucracy of your institution is so high, is that when you're submitting, they're basically vetting to say, is this an application we can support? Is this an application that followed all the rules? And that is this an application that our institution actually wants to be submitting? And every institution takes a different amount of time and has different mechanisms to do that vetting. So if you cannot directly submit your application, which is going to be the case for a large proportion of you, you really, really need to be able to work with your institutional support staff so that your application you've spent all this time on actually makes that deadline. All right, so some timelines for completing all the non-research plan components. And I highly suggest that at minimum 2 months out, preferably 3 months out, that you have compiled a list of all information your application will need, and you start collecting that information and writing all the non-research plan components. 1 month out, you really should have all the research components drafted. You should have made all of your requests for any reagents or collaborations. That can include that you're going to have to draft the letters of collaboration. Most collaborators that I've worked with want you as the applicant to draft those letters, and then they will tweak them or edit them. But by drafting the letters, you're helping the collaborator know exactly what you need from them. Also, that all necessary biosketches should be collected, and editing for compliance with the rules should begin. And this will include any mentors, any collaborators, as well as your own biosketch, so that both the research office can look at the biosketches and make sure they're compliant. And if you're not really sure what a good biosketch looks like, it also gives the opportunity for any mentors to start to really refine your biosketch to really sell who you are as an applicant the best as possible. And absolutely no later than 2 weeks out should all of your non-research plan components should be written and submitted to your research office for review. This makes sure that you've done everything correctly. Even people who've been writing grants for years make mistakes with this. They forget components. It could be that the rules changed and the person didn't know that. The research offices, part of their job is to make sure that all these research plan components are correct. If you are at all uncertain about the way you've written things, get them to your research office 1 full month out so that they have the time to vet them. 2 weeks might be too short of a time frame if it's coming up on a really heavy deadline. Okay. All right. So is everybody okay? Any questions right now? I just pulled up the chat in case that there is. And so right this second, I don't see anything being typed. So I'm going to go on to the next section. Okay, which here. Okay. So I kind of talked about some big picture things about the non-research plan components. Now I'm going to go through some specific parts of the research plan. That the first one I want you to consider are the environment pages. Almost all grant mechanisms require you to write an environment page. The purpose of those is that you make the extent and quality of both your dedicated research space as well as the overall research environment clear. And this resource pages can really strengthen your application since they show that your institution invests its resources towards your success. Reviewers do look for this sort of support and mark down applications that don't have strong institutional backing. If you are in the type of appointment where you have direct institutional support, such as a startup package, don't hesitate to talk about your startup package in your environment pages, that it shows that your institution is actually investing in your success, so that it's not a negative at all to have a good startup package. It's actually a positive. Now, the thing about environment pages is that I find that young investigators often get versions of the environment pages from their mentor, their postdoc mentor, their clinical mentor, and that if they're coming from a so-called elite institution, you will often find that the environment pages are extremely minimal. And if you're coming from an institution, let's say Harvard, you can often get away with very vague environment pages because everybody who's reviewing is like, yeah, Harvard, it's fantastic. They can do anything there. However, if you work at an institution that might not be familiar to a reviewer, and pretty much everybody who's on this call is likely to be working at such an institution because that's a CTR member institution, it's really crucial to write this specifically. That it could be that being here, you have access to better facilities than at a so-called elite institution. A really great example of that is the bioimaging centers at the University of Delaware. They're world-class. They're actually as good or better than institutions that are extremely well-known. But it's very possible that the reviewer of your application would have no way of knowing what that fabulous resource is. And as an example, I spent the first 15 years of my career at the University of Delaware being the only person in the entire state of Delaware who had a grant from the National Eye Institute. The only reason that reviewers didn't mark me down for environment is that I put in an incredibly detailed environment page that made it super clear that I had everything needed to be able to do my research at a high level here. Similarly, if you are in a situation with a clinical environment, you have to make it super clear that you actually have the patient population you need to do your studies. And if you don't make that super clear, that they might knock you down because they're like, oh, you don't see enough patients to be able to do the study you're proposing. And so the take home here is that keep in mind that being at a CTR member institution means you're way less likely to get benefit of the doubt about the research environment. And you really do have to sell that your proposed work has to be done at the highest levels, or can be done here at the highest levels, by talking about the composition of your department, your resources for research, and so forth. And then the other thing that I can't emphasize enough is that be extraordinarily careful about canned boilerplates. For instance, anybody who's working at the University of Delaware, I'd be happy to share my environment pages with them. But there's this tendency that, oh, I don't want to deal with environment pages. Oh, this senior investigator handed me their environment pages, so that's all good, so I don't need to worry about that, and I will just plug that right into the application. But if that person is doing different research than you, their environment page is going to be emphasizing different aspects of the environment. So while you can start with a canned boilerplate, you want to make sure that you have customized or elaborated on why this environment is strong for your specific research. And generally, you don't want to include resources that are completely not relevant to your research plan. And it also doesn't hurt to specify that I have this specific resource which will be incredibly important to do my work for a particular reason. The more customized your environment page is for your application, the more convincing it is that those resources actually exist. Now, I've already talked about Biosketches to some extent, but I really can't emphasize their importance enough. Make sure that they comply with the requested format. For this group, the NIH style is most common, but don't submit an NIH style Biosketch for an NSF grant. It's not compliant. Make sure you know what they're requesting. Now, I think that the biggest mistake I see people make is that in the section on contributions to science, they may only give a list of just a list of 3 or 4 papers. They might give a couple abstracts, but they don't elaborate on what they did and why they did it and why anybody cared. That the contributions to science section has a commentary about the project, who cares about it, and your contributions to solving a particular problem. You have to get over the tendency to not want to toot your own horn. The NIH Biosketch really expects you to be able to say clearly and forcefully what your skills, knowledge, and abilities are, and how those have been used to really forward a scientific question. Don't hesitate if you have contributions that are not directly related to your proposal. Just put the ones that are first, but if I think you're allowed to have up to 5 contributions. Even if the 5th contribution is your undergraduate research project where you got a 4th author paper, put that on there. That also, early career scientists are encouraged to include unpublished contributions or unpublished research projects, and these can include things like manuals and standard operating procedures, GenBank accession numbers, and so forth. Now, if it turns out you have 5 contributions to science, each with publications, definitely concentrate on those. However, if you're junior and you have a poster presentation from a project you worked on in medical school or something, put that down. But you really want to be thoughtful and show that you're capable of doing research that actually contributes to the field. The other thing is that all biosketches start with a personal statement. Now, one of the things you have to be extraordinarily careful about is that personal statement should be customized to every single grant you apply. And you also need to make sure that the biosketches of your mentors and your collaborators also are customized for your project. So if somebody sends you a biosketch and it's clearly the biosketch that they used to submit their last grant, and it doesn't talk about their ability to be a mentor, it doesn't talk about their success to be a mentor, it doesn't talk about why their skills will help you forward your career, that first paragraph really needs to be rewritten. Having a customized personal statement and a biosketch from a mentor or from a collaborator is really a sign that a collaboration is real and the collaborator is engaged with you. And this is a big reason that I would absolutely get any submitted biosketches that are not your own, get your hands on them a good month ahead of the submission deadline, and then work with the person to really edit that biosketch so that that personal statement is customized for your project. That it's just so important. If anybody wants to see a couple examples of a biosketch, I have my straight research biosketch and I have a mentoring biosketch that I'd be happy to share with anybody who wants it. Just shoot me an email and I'll send them to them. But you will see that the personal statement section of those two biosketches is very different. Okay. A few other things that I highly recommend is that you want to list your total number of publications on your biosketch. And it doesn't even hurt to emphasize this both in your personal statement and your contributions to science sections. Because the thing you have to keep in mind that even if you're well published and famous, if you have a study section member who doesn't know you well, that you want to make it really clear that you're very productive, because productivity is an important criteria for when they're deciding whether to fund your grant. The other thing that I would absolutely include, even if you only have a publication or two, is to create a My Bibliography website on the National Library of Medicine website. This is a URL that you can include on your biosketch that has a list of every single publication you've ever published, and that this confirms your actual productivity. That it's super important because that while you are writing about your contributions to science, there's a lot of reviewers out there who only just want to count. They want to see how many publications you have had in what years of your career. And the My Bibliography is that full list of your publications. And just as a warning, if you have more than just a handful of publications, it does take some time to create that My Bibliography well, and that it's really hard to get it done for a busy clinical collaborator who've published a lot if they don't have a My Bibliography on your biosketch. So give yourself enough lead time to put that together. The My Bibliography will be used by the reviewers to decide whether that mentor is actually scientifically productive or not. You want it there, it needs to be well done, and it needs to be complete. Now, the third thing, though, about biosketches is that if you can tell a complete story without placing in preparation or submitted papers on your biosketch, you're better off. Now, if you put a lot of in preparation papers, that seems like an obvious attempt to inflate your progress. And attempts to inflate what you've done is really against the rules. However, you are encouraged to include intermediate research projects, which are like preprints on a preprint server or things like poster abstracts. So I think the take home here is that if you're a young investigator, really talk about everything you've accomplished. You want to be able to sell yourself as a productive scientist as easy as you can, or as best as you can. Now, the last piece of the biosketch is the research support section. If you're a newly independent investigator and you've received startup funds for your research, list that under support on your biosketch. And part of that research support is also your dedicated research space. Now, you also want to make sure if you have any current funding or any that you know of you will get, this speaks to your productivity. Also, that you want to include all funding within the past 3 years for sure. Sometimes you can include older grants if there's space. If, let's say, you had a grant 5 years ago and then your clinical duties got busy and you don't have a grant within the 3-year window, you should include that. Also, that since a lot of people on this call are MRDA folks. Include your MRDA on your Biosketch as funding. Even after the MRDA is over, you should be including it on your Biosketch as funding for at least the next 3 years. All right, so do I have any questions on Biosketches for right now? I just opened up the chat real quick just to see. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the budget. Now, budget in some ways can be one of the more difficult pieces of the application. However, as a young investigator, it's probably that you're going to be given a budget. We give, like for CTR pilots, I think it's $80,000 a year for 1 year. So you are basically writing a budget to spend $80,000. But other grants say that they want a fully justified and outlined budget where they want every single thing you're going to be spending money for. So those can be difficult if you don't personally have a really clear idea about what things cost. That's a case you really need to be talking to your mentors about, because you do not want to either highball, in other words, ask for way more money than the project will cost. Actually, lowballing is equally bad because your reviewers know how much science costs. And if you're asking for less money than you actually need to do the work, the reviewers will say, oh, that person's being naive, and they're really not going to be able to do the project because they have not asked for enough money to do the project. So a thing to think about with budget is that be on the high end for reasonable to what you're going to be submit. This is that reviewers are always asked to cut money from grants, and if you are asking for much more than reasonable, they will cut you. If you ask on the high end of reasonable, if they cut you, you might still be able to do the project with some little bit of belt tightening. One thing, though, is that anybody who's going for most of the NIH grants, that they're going to things such as R21s, R15s, and R01s, that as long as the R01 is for under $250,000 a year in direct costs, the only specific justifications they're going to want is your staff and the duties and percent effort of the staff. The rest of the money is just going to be in kind of non-specific supplies. Okay. So and I would absolutely, can't emphasize enough, do not lowball your budget. That will hurt you in both the long term and the short term. In the short term, you might not get the grant at all if the reviewers don't think you can do it. If you do get the grant and you've lowballed your budget, then you're going to be judged on whether you completed the work, not on how little budget you had to complete the work. And it can basically kill your long-term productivity if you just don't have enough money to complete the project. All right, so with that, I'm also going to talk about those of you who work on human subjects, which I think are a large portion of the call. Writing the human subjects section well can make or break a grant. And this is a combination, I will say, of human subjects / environment pages to work with human subjects. The grant review committees are looking for strong evidence that you have fully considered the challenges of identifying your patient population. You need to show power analysis to say that you have made realistic approximations of how many patients you're going to see, how many of them are willing to consent to your study, and that if you don't have enough patients in your local environment, that they're really going to be looking at then how have you been trying to bring in alternate sources of patients, and is that going to overcome the challenge of not having enough patients in your environment? You also want to be really specific about the racial, age, and gender diversity of your subject population. NIH is very, very serious about research across the lifespan. And for instance, if you're only working on a pediatric population, you need to justify very, very well why you're not doing the study, including more adult patients. And I would really encourage you not to be too obvious here. That if you are studying humans and you're studying prostate cancer, you really do want to specifically state that it does not why it does not include women. If you're studying research on Alzheimer's, you really want to specify why it doesn't include children. Sometimes things can't be too obvious, and you really want to just make sure that a tired reviewer doesn't ding you for something you don't want to deserve or you don't deserve. Again, you want to justify your sample sizes biostatistically. You definitely want to give your power analyses. Also, that you might be doing research that is exempt or not human. And you really want to include the justification for this. For instance, while human cell lines or de-identified surgical tissue is considered not human, the reviewers may not be familiar with those exemption rules. Another example is that if you're doing a survey of, let's say, physicians about a treatment guideline, that's actually considered exempt research. But grant reviewers might not know that. So you want to be able to get a letter stating that your research is exempt and be able to write that directly, explicitly into the application. One thing that you absolutely do not want to have happen is to have your grant reviewed or flagged for not complying with human subjects rules for any reason. Even if it turns out the flag is wrong, it is way harder to get a grant through that has been flagged by the NIH for any reason, even if you're correct and the reviewer was wrong. It just makes your life way more difficult. So by saying obvious things, it's way less likely to get flagged. From a similar thing with animal subjects, you have to be super careful about justifying any kind of single-sex study. That now there is a specific rule from the NIH that you have to be able to address that animals of both sexes are included, and that simple things like saying females give more variable results because of the estrous cycle, that is not a sufficient reason for excluding them. And if you propose a study that uses only males and you say, oh, it's because females are more variable, the expectation is you should be including females and working with that variability. You also need to justify doing animal research just to start with. And you want to make sure it's really clear that you've done everything you can to minimize pain and distress with the animals. And you want to make sure that your euthanasia guidelines affect both your IACUC protocol and why your approved protocol is different from the American Veterinary Association euthanasia guidelines. Okay. Now, one thing that I cannot urge you enough, I have been reviewing for NIH for 20 years, and the most common mistake is that people didn't do their animal and human subject sections until the last minute. They're like, oh, I have one, or I'm going to borrow from somebody, and they lift it from another application and plop it into theirs. The animal and human subject sections are, in fact, read by the reviewers, and that if the human subjects or animal subject sections are not appropriately optimized for the application, and that can be a huge red flag. I have seen applications submitted where it's an animal study where the nature of the mouse mutations being studied wasn't changed for the current application. The animal justifications for the experiments to be performed wasn't changed. The human subjects recruiting was based on a different disease than the one being studied and so forth. The other thing is avoid being vague. That you want to be super specific if the application is asking for specific details about your animal and human subjects protections. This is a place that you might get away with it. Some reviewers don't read stuff carefully. However, many reviewers do read these sections super carefully, and they expect explicit and application-specific answers to all the questions. Again, if you're vague, you could get flagged. And if it's like end-of-year money or places where the turnarounds have to be very quick because of certain financial deadlines, you might not get your grant if you don't have everything in place. So again, kind of to belabor the point, do not wait to do these sections last on animal and human subjects. This is a huge mistake that if you mess this up, it will kill your grant. So again, do animal and human subjects 1 to 2 months out at least, so that you can make sure everything is incredibly specific for your application. Okay, so one thing that you have to consider is that this idea of just-in-time information. Now, this includes things like the NIH doesn't typically require that you have IRB or IACUC approval at the time of your grant submission. And that this might mean that you might be tempted to wait to get the paperwork done until you know you'll get the grant. However, that is a really good way to get a good grant score and not get funded. If your IRB or IACUC is slow or picky and the NIH is trying to fund your grant on a fast track because of budgetary rules, that you could absolutely lose your award if your IACUC or your IRB gets held up. And that if you have approval at the time of submission, include the number just to show that, yes, I do have full approval for this study. Now, another thing that happens with just-in-time is that let's say you're submitting a K award or an R award directly to the NIH. One of the things they're going to want is called current and pending or other support and pending applications. Even for the CTR pilot, if you get a good score and they think they're going to fund it, they're going to ask you for this other support and pending applications form. It's basically an audit that's done by NIH to ensure that you're not double dipping funds, so that if you propose very highly similar projects, they do not want to give you, they won't give you the same money for doing the same project. Just as a aside, this is a huge thing that if you've heard in the news, the Chinese scientists who've gotten into trouble with the NIH and are getting FBI investigated, this is actually what they've gotten themselves into trouble with, is that they got an NIH grant and a grant from the Chinese government to do the same work. And that actually violated, and they did not disclose that in other support and pending. So they were double dipping the same grant funds at the same time. So that this audit, basically, they're asking you, what other money do you have? And then what other grants do you have outstanding? So that maybe you don't know whether you're going to get the funding or not, but if you've submitted the same grant twice, you have to justify why the pending application, what's going to happen to it if your current NIH award gets funded. Now, from NIH Central, and I think even from the CTR program, just-in-time information is usually requested for grants in the top 30% or so of scores. Now, sometimes from NIH, you'll see you'll get your score on the score sheet on the NIH website, and then a little button that says JIT will show up. Generally, that you should wait to submit your just-in-time information until they specifically request it. And that's because for federal R grants, only the top 15 or 20% of grants get funded. So that while the button's there, it doesn't necessarily mean that your grant is going to get funded. One thing that I have found, though, in the past 2 years, that the JIT process has gotten more complicated, and that even after you submit everything that's asked for, you're very likely to get additional questions from the NIH, and quick response to those inquiries is essential. And you cannot directly respond because, again, your grant is not to you. Your grant is to your university. So it's actually your university who has to make the responses to those questions. You cannot do it directly. A big one that I've encountered recently are things called debarment audits. So if you have submitted an application and you have staff on there, and any of those staff members have a name similar to anybody who has ever been debarred from the federal government, and this is a list of people who did things that were not desirable and are barred from being paid for or supported by the U.S. government, if the person's on the debarment audit, they will ask you to certify that it's not the same person. And you have very little information to go on, actually, for these debarment audits. There's a woman who works for me named Yan Wang who has one of the most common names you could ever imagine. And there's another Yan Wang who works in New York, who was debarred while working in New York City. And you don't even have the gender of the person. But you do need to do some due diligence to make sure that the staff member has not been previously debarred by the federal government from receiving funding. That there's also situations where the NIH want confirmation of full approval of your animal and human subjects protocols. In other words, the exact signed off sheet showing that all that paperwork is in place. And there could be all sorts of other reasons that your JIT is being flagged. Again, this is something that you drop everything that you're doing at that moment and just get that JIT information in. Okay, so a few other things that people tend to mess up are things like resource and data sharing plans. And this is if there are any resources for the scientific community or you collect a large amount of data. And this is particularly from like a clinical trial or a lot of human subjects. There's actually rules that if it's funded by the feds, you must share these resources and make the data publicly available in some way, shape, or form. In your resource and data sharing plans, your institution probably has a boilerplate about legal aspects of data resource transfer. Like for data on large patient populations, you could build in the information about how to make sure that you are IRB and HIPAA compliant. For resources, you can talk about, say you've made a genetically engineered mouse. You can add stuff about you're only going to give it to people who follow the rules and so forth. But leaving the sections blank, that's a way to get your application flagged. Another one is biosafety. That people forget that biosafety is an issue if you're working at biosafety level 2 or above. This could be lentiviruses, retroviral vectors, a lot of human clinical material. You just want to say how you're going to address all the biosafety issues for your study. Okay. All right. So so basically, I think the take-home message that I want to give here is that don't think that, oh, this is just bureaucracy that nobody reads. That I have seen plenty of people mess up their chances of getting funded by not putting emphasis and doing a good job on the other pages of the application. They are read, they are evaluated, and they will be considered in the final scores for funding. And even if your research is well funded, if you mess this up, it could easily mean that you've lost your chances. So with that, I think that's all I want to say today. So if anybody has questions, just either chime in and take yourself off mute, or you can ask a question in the chat. And I will definitely reiterate the offered to do Biosketch reviews for people to give you some hints about how to make your case for being an independent investigator stronger based on how your Biosketch is written. So with that, I'm done.